I would say by most people's standards, those are some pretty good, successful numbers. What or who do you attribute that success to?
You, Hafey.
Welcome to the Creative Control Room Podcast, episode number 111. I'm your operator, Ryan Hafey. This is my Creative Control Room, and this is a podcast for podcasters. In this week's show, we've got a special one for you. Retired former two-time welterweight boxing world champion, fight commentator, and podcast host, Showtime Shawn Porter, joins the show to share his knowledge and expertise on how to be an engaging podcast host and interviewer. We also talk about his podcast, aptly called the Porter Way Podcast, and Shawn shares some of the insights he's gained for being in the podcast game for over a couple years now. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Shawn Porter. I'm honored to be joined today by former two-time boxing world champion turned fight commentator and podcast host, Showtime Shawn Porter. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy day to join me here on the Creative Control Room Podcast. How we doing?
Anything for you, Hafey.
I appreciate you. It should be noted, by the way, that the only reason you're here on my little rinky-dink podcast is because I happen to produce your podcast known as the Porter Way Podcast, which we will talk about a little bit.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get some insight from you today about just how to be an engaging podcast host, how to conduct did you want to say something?
I have to correct you real quick.
Okay. Already. Wow. We're off to a great start.
Well, no. I'm not here because you produce my podcast. So let's be honest and real. I'm here because you and I have a true friendship and we've been working together. Oh my God, we've been working together for a super long time. So, I mean, collectively, it just is kind of like the maturation process of eventually I'm going to want Shawn on my podcast. And here I am. You know what I mean?
Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
This is a little different from what you said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your podcast a little bit today. Also want to talk about just get some insight from you on how you have become such an engaging podcast host, how you can conduct such interesting and engaging interviews. So we'll get into that. The first thing I want to ask you, though, is if someone were to come up to you on the street these days, obviously you had a long history in boxing, but you're retired now. If someone came up to you on the street that you never met and asked, what do you do? What is your answer to them right now?
I think my answer to them is usually, I actually do I do a number of things. And then I kind of list the things that I do now. I don't really talk much about boxing. And the cool part about it is being on the commentating side of the sport and being able to do that along with box at the same time. It was like my brand and my face grew even bigger. And I'd find myself at the grocery store and someone had seen me doing commentary. They didn't see me doing boxing, So I take it for what it's worth, man. I boxed literally my entire life. I started boxing when I was 5 years old. And to this day, if you don't ask me if I box or you don't refer to that at all, I'm just as I was when I was 8 years old or 12 or in high school. I just never told people that I boxed. I don't know why that was, but it's the same thing now. So I say, I have a couple of websites I'm doing, and I have a podcast, and I'm doing commentary for TV, things like that. I kind of keep boxing separate now, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about the podcast a little bit. If I had to describe it as the producer of the show, I would say it's obviously a boxing focused podcast. But it's a show that tries to kind of marry the worlds of boxing and entertainment. You don't just have boxers on, you have celebrities on every now and then. But sell the podcast a little bit. What is the Porter Way Podcast about in your own words?
Everybody says, man, this is my year. This is my year. This is the year for the Porter Way Podcast. We are turning it up another notch, and exactly what you alluded to. The who's of entertainment, not just entertainers, but the who's of entertainment will be on the Porter Way Podcast this year. That is my goal. Ultimately, it worked out for the good. I've never been just about boxing, and so I didn't want the podcast to be just about boxing. And one of the co-hosts on the show, Carson, he says, SP, like this is your niche. This is what people know you for. Start there, and then you can branch out as the podcast grows. And damn it if he wasn't right. I mean, we started there, and the thing people say about boxing is it's a niche sport where, you don't have millions of people getting into it, doing it, so on and so forth. So the podcast grew very quickly and is continuing to grow. And I think it's because we have something very unique with the podcast where we have the quote unquote expert and myself, but then the supporting cast, the average viewer relates to the supporting cast, but they love me. And so it's like you get a whole bunch of, you get everything that you want in one pot. You get the realists who really enjoy boxing and want to hear the professionals' perspective, but then you also have everyone else who's like, well, I want to know how they saw it because they were probably seeing it the way that I was seeing it. So it is, man. It's still a work in progress, and I would say definitely this year we're going to move forward. We're never going to ever look back. And I would say that this year we will get into more of becoming more of a entertaining and entertainment podcast, opposed to just a boxing podcast that may talk about other things.
What was it that initially wanted you to start a podcast? Was it because I know fight commentary came before the podcast, and I know you enjoyed that. Was that kind of like what was like, maybe this is where I want to go? What was the reasoning?
I had been hearing about podcasts. I had never listened to them, but I just kept hearing it. And from what I could hear and see, it just looked like exactly what we do. And I love radio, not just TV, but I love radio. So I would love to go into the studios and just push the buttons and all that. And so it was like I was able to blend what I had already been doing on TV along with what I had been seeing and doing growing up. The opportunity to interview other athletes and be around the table with friends in somewhat of a studio atmosphere, but then be able to produce something that's on YouTube and goes out to the hundreds of millions of people around the world. And when I first got the idea to start the podcast, it was because Inside PBC Boxing on Fox, I was really heavily involved in that. And once the show was canceled, I was on such a high from doing it. I was like, I have to do more of that. And I was like, we're pandemic time. And so it was like, hey, let's do this podcast. And I've been thinking about it, and it just felt like the right time.
So between your main podcast channel and the Clips channel that we have set up for you, we've got about 112,000 subscribers. We're getting about 20,000 downloads or so a month on the audio podcast. I would say by most people's standards, those are some pretty good, successful numbers. What or who do you attribute that success to?
You, Hasty. And I'm a team player, which makes things very, very simple, fun. I mean, everything. And so when we go all the way back to the beginning, I called you and I say, yo, I want to do a podcast. I don't know anything about it. What do you think? And you were like, yeah, I've been doing a podcast for a few months. I can help you out. And it just kind of blossomed from there. You talk about the supporting cast that we have with two T's, Carson, and also Shawn Porter right there. It was my brain that said these guys are going to be perfect for what I want to do and for what we can do. And it seems to be no less than perfect from that standpoint. So, I mean, obviously I contribute the success to myself, but me being the kind of team player that I am, man, I really wouldn't even say I'm the head coach. I'm just another player that happens to start. I'm not coming off the bench, and everybody else is doing their job to collect the rebounds and get the ball on the other side of the court so we can lay it up.
Yeah, I would agree. I say it's a team effort. There's obviously the team on camera. You guys create the content that draws the people in, but then there's all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, and I think we all mesh really well together. So I would agree with that.
I mean, at the end of the day, our numbers would not be what they are with just me, because I would have to do so much more and I really wouldn't say I'm not capable of doing the things that I would have to do, but the hustle and the grind would be much more rigorous than it is. And it's because of everyone who's involved.
What would you say you've learned about just the whole world of podcasting over the past couple of years?
Um, it's really hard. Maybe if anything, I've learned that all content is not good content. All content's not bad content. I've learned that not everybody's going to love every episode. Not everybody's going to love every moment of every episode, you know. And me being my own worst critic, it's really hard for me to watch the podcast, or even when we would finish a show immediately as we leave the studio, I'm thinking of everything I didn't say, could have said, so on and so forth. So I've learned to be patient, and I've just learned that as long as you keep putting out the content that you believe in, eventually you'll reach the people, and you'll get them all. But they're not always going to love it all all at one time.
Sure. So what's the goal then for the podcast long term? Do you have a plan? You just kind of going with the flow, see what it matures into? What's the plan?
The main plan for the Porterweight podcast, I think, as much as I've tried to stay away from being strictly a boxing podcast, I do think that the Porterweight podcast has the ability to become the number one podcast in boxing. That is certainly a goal of mine. Beyond boxing, I want to be a podcast that businessmen feel they need to watch. I want to be the kind of podcast that 15-year-olds and 10-year-olds feel like they want to watch, and 50 and 60-year-olds want to watch. I want to be the podcast that everyone and listen to. But I think that my podcast has the ability to reach millions and affect millions every single time we put out an episode. And that's why I started doing a motivational message at the end of every episode, opposed to just once a month. I said, you know what? I'm gonna reach people, and every time I reach them, I need to hit them hard with something that's gonna make them think and improve on whoever they are, or who they are.
I like that. So let's switch gears a little bit. How would you describe, because your podcast is very conversational, it's very laid back, very casual. How would you describe your conversational style?
My conversational style is very funny because I'm a thinker by nature. I'm not really a talker, and I had to kind of grow into becoming a talker. I'm an entertainer by nature, which I think has helped with me becoming a talker. But for the most part, I'm more reactive than I am someone who can really drive the conversation. Also, why I included the cast, because I know myself, and driving an entire hour by myself, I just knew I wouldn't be effective, because I don't have that, or haven't had that, So you think, like when we have a guest come on our show, I'll ask one question, maybe two. I try to kind of establish the energy of the show, or the energy of the interview, and then I allow the other guys to interact with the guests, because I want to sit back and listen to where they take it, and based on the responses, then I'll know where I want to take it. So I would say, if anything, I'm more of a reactive interviewer, or reporter, or journalist, if you will.
In boxing, you have to talk a lot. You have to kind of sell yourself. You do a lot of interviews. You have to sell the fight.
Yeah.
How much of an influence did all of that experience, do you think, have on kind of your presentation style on the podcast?
A lot, actually. A lot. It was. I believe in God, and I just believe that God has worked right on time in my life. I started doing the commentary consistently in 2018. And that was right as I was kind of coming into my own, understanding my personality, understanding what I wanted to present to people on TV and in the interviews, so on and so forth. But then when you take a look at being on TV with Fox and things like that, they help mold the personality that I have, the nature of myself. They molded it, and they said, you can do more, give us more. And it was like, okay, so I can do more there. That means when I do a boxing interview, I can do more there too, So it really went hand in hand, where I was learning a lot in front of the camera. And then I was just taking that over to the boxing world, and really just kind of expanding who I was as a fighter. And it really happened right on time because I started to see how effective promoting could be for a fighter. I started understanding how effective social media could be and all that. And so it kind of all happened like right on time for me.
What about acting? I know you've done some acting. I think you mentioned that you also have an acting coach. How often do you find yourself dipping into that skill set when it comes to fight commentary and the podcast?
A lot actually. And definitely on the podcast, it's become so natural to me now to just kind of do things and say things that I wouldn't normally do or say based on me understanding like, hey, here's a chance to have fun. And essentially that's really why I wanted to get into acting. I knew it was going to be fun and I knew that I could do it. And it's kind of like, that complex that we have as fighters. We always want to challenge ourselves. So sure enough, I kind of proved myself right. Don't mean to toot my own horn, but I can do that thing, man. I can act and I can kind of pop in and pop out and kind of get into characters and things like that. And it's a lot of fun.
I've seen some of the clips. You do all right. Yeah, you do decent.
It's been a lot of fun, man. But the funny thing is, like when we're on, like when I do live television, there may be a moment where they may want me to do something, and it's just kind of like it's like a freestyle of what I would do in the acting world, kind of being Shawn, but kind of being Shawn in a space that it's gonna wow people, and that's why I call myself Showtime, man. I love wowing people. I love entertaining people.
How much prep do you typically do for a podcast episode, and how do you prep for a show?
So our podcast is boxing based, which makes my job very, very easy because with me being involved with this so long and having the kind of intuition that I have, it's really easy for me to watch just a couple of rounds of boxing. Hold on, Diggy. And I'm gonna know exactly how this fight's gonna play itself out. So I try to have a notebook with me. I try to write things down and I just try to make sure that, once that red light comes on, I don't forget anything, So most of the writing down and things of that nature is just so that I make sure that I don't miss anything.
How do you feel like, how does the amount of prep that you do for a show affect the quality of your performance, or do you think it does at all?
Every time. And that's what I started to do. So when I started doing live TV on fight nights, I'm a sponge. So how my dad taught me to be. And so I'm just watching everybody and everyone who's been doing this for, 20 plus years. They all have notebooks. They've all got papers. Everything's written down. Everything's printed up already. And as we're moving along through the night, they're ripping stuff up, tossing it over their shoulder. Let's go on to the next segment. Those type of things. And I found that to be very effective for me on TV. Hey, gotta be quiet, okay? Gotta be quiet.
What's up?
Say hi, Hasty. Okay. Shh. I found
like your hair. Oh, they can't probably hear me, can they?
Yeah. No. I found that to be very effective when I was doing live TV. I started writing down my notes, started going on, and I felt more ready. And so when we first started the podcast, it was like, yeah, we watched the fights. Let's do it. Yeah, we watched the fights. Let's do it. And I always felt like I was missing something. And then so eventually I just said, you know what? In order for this podcast to be as good as it can be, and I don't want to cheat anybody, I have to do my homework. Hold on. I have to do my homework. And so, yeah, I do prep, and it definitely works.
So you kind of talked about your interview style a little bit earlier. How much prep do you do before hosting an interview? And I know, to my view, when I see you doing interviews, it seems very impromptu. It seems just kind of improvised. How much of that is kind of prepared, and how much of that is you just kind of coming up with stuff on the fly?
It's coming up with stuff on the fly. I think that's the next step for me, is to start preparing myself when we have a guest, to be really ready for that guest. I've seen Ant do it, and it impresses me that Ant's gone to another level too. When we first started the podcast, Ant said, literally, I'm not studying nothing. I'm not writing nothing down. I'm just, y'all let me know when to be there, and I'll come in and do the show. Should I stop? I'm working. I'm working. He's like, yeah, I'll come in and do the show. Now that man preps himself and
Yeah,
he's
he
ready
does.
anytime we have a guest, which I find to be very, very impressive. So that's the next step for me is to start really getting ready for the guests that we have on our show. I don't like being as impromptu. I'm not gonna lie, I impress myself. Which I think is why I've continued to do it. But I know I need to move out of that and move into more of a professional way of carrying on interviews.
So as someone who's been on each side, on both sides of an interview, what in your opinion makes for a good
Yeah.
interview, and what does each person kind of need to bring to the table?
For me, the number one thing with the interview, I don't like interviews to be QA, QA, QA. I think that's bland. I think that's boring. I think that's what everybody sees and expects. I like for my interviews to be conversations. And I like for the conversation to drive the next question, to drive the next answer. And so that's how I like to carry on my interviews. I think that it's much more fun and people can see how real it is, and it's not just QA asking the questions that everybody expects to be asked.
Sure. So last question for you here. Just generally speaking, what universal advice could you offer to help someone just be a better, more engaging podcast host?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think it's gonna sound very simple, very cliche, but be yourself. That's how I got where I am. And disclaimer, that may not work for everyone. Some people may actually need gimmicks. Some people may actually need an alter ego or a character to kind of become in order to pull this off. But for me, the best advice that I could give is be yourself. If you like to have fun, don't turn on your podcast and then all of a sudden you turn off the fun. Keep the fun on, dial it up. That's kind of how I live my life. I just try to make everything as real and as genuine as possible. So that would be the best advice I could give. And then of course, if you are someone that can prep or things like that, do your homework. I think that when you do your homework, it disguises any flaws that may be in your game. If you haven't done the homework, everyone's going to see the flaws. They'll see the stuttering. They'll see the second guessing. They'll see the eyes going both ways. What's next? So yeah, do your homework and be yourself.
All right. I appreciate that. Thank you.
That's what you've done, Hafey.
Thank you. Thank you. How'd I do today? Rate my performance.
I appreciate you, man. You know that. Five gloves, man. 5 gloves.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here, Shawn. I appreciate your time. Be sure to go check out the Porterweight podcast on YouTube or wherever you happen to watch or listen to podcasts. And if you do check it out, make sure you let them know that Ryan from the Creative Control Room podcast sent you over there. Shawn, we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you very much.
You got it, man. Thank you.
Man, it's hard not to like Shawn. He's a great dude, and he has a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share from his time in the boxing game and from being behind the mic. I hope you were able to soak up some of the wisdom he had to offer in this conversation. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing wherever you happen to be watching or listening. Follow me on social media at Ryan Hafey on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Check out the description below for relevant links and gear recommendations, and we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.